Thank you for tuning into Literary Blend, a publishing podcast. I'm your host, Demi Michelle Schwartz. There's no perfect recipe for chasing a dream in the publishing industry, but I hope the conversations on this show give you the ingredients you need to bake yours into reality. So let's flip the page and get into this chapter of Literary Blend. Hi friends, welcome back to Literary Blend. Today's chapter is called Outlining Time, and joining me on the show to chat all about outlining is Mylee J. Miller. Hi Mylee.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm super excited to be here today.
Yes, I'm super excited to have you. How are you doing today?
I'm doing good. This is my highlight of my day so far, so I'm ready. I'm ready to go.
Amazing. Well, let's get right into it. Before we chat about outlining, though, I would love for you to share a little about yourself and your journey in publishing so far.
So, I'm an author based near the west coast of the USA, a literary podcast host, the creator of #PosterPit, and what I like to call a hybrid author in that I aim to both self publish and traditionally publish various works. I'm also currently querying 2 novels and working on the first draft of a high fantasy book about estranged sisters/ boutique owners hired to kill the same man. So, that's as much as I got.
Amazing. Perfect. So let's dive into chatting about outlining. So I know you and I both started more as pantsers and transitioned into being plotters. So can you give some insight into why you chose to make this shift in your own writing process?
So I started writing when I was super young, and I feel like that gives a little bit of context as why I started as a pantser, but I was also a pantser up until I was probably 14, 16, high school age. And the reason I changed was because I found myself starting a lot of projects and not finishing them. I would get through like half a book and then I'd stop writing, or I'd get through half a series and then I'd just stop writing because I had no real end goal in mind for when I was going to write a book and where I wanted it to go. So part of the reason that made me change was that, but also the fact that my biological mother also wrote, and she introduced me to grid outlining, and that was my first little taste of outlining, and it worked so much better than just winging it, at least for me, because I know everyone's different.
Amazing. So for me, when I wrote my first book, it was my thesis of my MFA program. And though I had an idea of the main plot points, like it was a mystery. So I knew who the killer was, I knew the big twists and turns, but with the chapters in between those main plot points, I had no idea what I was doing. And so I found it really difficult to go from chapter to chapter and connect the dots of the main plot points to where like my first 2 novels that I did this for, when it came time to revise, it was an absolute nightmare because both books were like over 100,000 words. There were so many scenes that weren't necessary. There were characters that weren't necessary. There were parts of the book where I was just like super confused of what was even happening. It didn't make sense for the overarching story. And so I decided to become a plotter because it helped me to write cleaner first drafts. And so now when I have my chapter by chapter outline, I know going into it that obviously the book isn't going to be perfect once it's drafted, but I do know that if I follow the outline I set for myself pretty closely, not exactly because I do deviate from it because my characters always surprise me, but if I follow it close enough to where I'm basically sticking to the framework of the story I set for myself, I know I'm going to end up with a pretty strong draft, which will make revisions much easier.
Yeah, yeah, I'm amazed that you actually had even a semblance of direction because I most certainly did not. So, well done for you for sure.
So, what would you say are some of the main benefits to outlining?
At least for me, I agree wholly with the revision aspect. I think outlines help so much with revisions. And I know that there's this new thing called reverse outlining, which a lot of pantsers will do after the first draft. I can't do that. My mind does not work that way. So it's always good for me to have that polished or semi polished first draft in terms of plot, at least, and then moving into revisions. But I also think something that's super helpful about outlining for me is being able to develop the characters before they hit the page to be able to get their motives and their goals down, because that really helps me guide my stories. I'm a super character driven writer, and I like my characters to take center stage when they walk onto the page of a manuscript. And so being able to outline that really helps me set the tone and the goals I have for the rest of the story as well.
That's amazing. That was actually one of the things I was going to mention because I think sometimes when writers think about plotting, they just think of the story and the scenes, but the characters are a very important part of this for the reasons you said. You need to know their goals, motivation, the conflicts, stakes, dig deep into what are they afraid of? What is their greatest wish? What's their biggest insecurity? These aspects of the character will help you when you're revising or when you're outlining the book because we need to think of the plot of the story and the characters as being woven together. The characters and their personalities, the decisions they make based on who they are and their GMCs will shape the story. And so, if you don't have an idea of who your character is, you're going to have a super cool, fun plot. But once you drop the character into that, it might not make sense for their story and their own journey that they're on. And so, I really love this idea of outlining, allowing you to look at the scenes of the story, but also the character and how you can weave those together. Can you think of any cons of outlining, any downsides?
My immediate thought is that on my outlining documents, I always deviate at least a little bit from my outlines. I know a lot of pantsers look at outlining and they're like, "Oh, it's a rigid thing. I have to follow it to the T." And I'm like, "I don't." So, despite all the preparation that goes into outlines, I generally don't follow them completely exactly. I actually have a color coding chart where I say orange highlights are for stuff I still keep but change slightly. Green are for the things I implement correctly. Red are for the things I remove. So I think the biggest con for me is that they're not always going to be what you end up doing, at least in my case. But they do help as the guideline in the format because most of it does stay the same.
Yeah, for sure. And that's something I mentioned too about deviating from it every once in a while. So for me, it's less of I need to follow this like it's the law and more of this is my guide. So even if I get off track a little bit and make a change that makes sense for the story, I know what I need to do to get back on track. I know what's coming versus not having any idea of how to get back on track. So I
Yeah.
completely relate to that. The one thing I wanted to mention is I'm not sure if you relate to this at all, but I am such a plotter now that if I don't have an extremely, extremely detailed chapter outline with a ton of notes, a ton of research, and everything, I cannot start drafting. I feel super insecure and nervous to start. And so for me, outlining can be a downside because it's not like I procrastinate drafting because I definitely want to write the story, but it's more of do I have enough figured out to start drafting, which can hold me back for a while.
I definitely feel that. I actually just got a book for my next project off of Amazon about poisonous fruits and flowers because I feel like I have to do that amount of research before I begin drafting. So I agree, and it does sometimes set me back a tiny bit to have this list of to do things that I want to do before I begin. So I agree as well.
Amazing. So now let's list 5 outlining tips. We'll alternate, and if we overlap, that's totally fine. So I would love for you to start. What is one you would like to share with everyone?
So my first outlining tip is kind of controversial, I feel like, but I feel like you need to make your own outline, what works for you. Because I know initially when people start outlining, they tend to follow formulas to a T. They go with the three act structure or whatever have you. But I also feel like as you grow as a writer, you need to be able to and be willing to change your outline to fit your stories. Because as you grow, you learn what format you like, what beats you like to hit, and they're not always exactly 100%. I know that I use what I call a three-act outline, but I also have very different names for the beats and the plot points that happen in those things compared to what usually happens in, the standard formula. So I feel like my first tip would be okay with making outline formats your own so that it best suits your story.
I love that so much. And that's a perfect transition to one of mine, which was to use these kind of beat sheets as more of gut checks rather than having to follow them. Because for me personally, when I'm plotting a new book, I don't want anything to restrict my creative process. And seeing a strict guide and very specific percentages of when certain things need to happen, those kind of stress me out and make me feel like my creativity is being restricted. And so, leading off of what you said, I try to use the beats as more of a check once I have my outline finished and when I'm going to revise it, because sometimes when I'm outlining, I might have a perfect midpoint scene, but it's a little late. It's not necessarily in the middle, but that's something that I can fix when I go back and fine tune the outline. So using the beat sheets as more as a gut check rather than something to follow while outlining is something I do.
100%, 100% agree. So, my next one is kind of weird, and I say this knowing entirely how hard it is to do for a lot of people, especially new writers. But my second tip would probably be getting outline betas. And if listeners don't know what that is, or because I made it up basically, as I made up the term, um, it's essentially a beta reader who looks over your outline and tells you about any glaring inconsistencies or plot holes. So they basically function as a normal beta reader, but they beta read your outlines. And I know that this takes an extreme level of trust, and you'd likely only want to do it with somebody you really know and trust and know will also give you constructive feedback. I would not recommend doing this with anybody who you just met randomly. But I do think it's important that if you can do this, definitely try to give your outline to readers who will be able to point out those plot holes early on so that you don't incorporate them into that first draft, and it makes for less of a cleanup later on in revisions.
Oh my gosh, I love that. Also, I have one that's similar too. Look at this. So, one of mine was to always turn to your writer friends if you're stuck. Even if you don't show them your entire outline, which, by the way, never thought of doing that. Definitely doing that next time with somebody I trust. But if there's just in general something that you're stuck on in your story, like I have writer friends that I'll explain generically, like, this is what I'm trying to do. They don't need to know the whole story, but just in general, like, this is the character, this is the situation. What do you think I can do? Like, I'm kind of at a plot hole here, or something just isn't quite working. You can always ask your writer friends for help as well.
Yes, I definitely agree. I did that just recently, so I agree completely 100%. So, my third tip is going to be um, again, something that I feel like people don't like to do when they think of outlines, but be okay with changing your outline while you're writing. Because I have had to do that numerous times. I get to a point in my draft where I deviate slightly too much, or I get a better idea for the ending, for example, and I have to allow myself to be like, okay, if it still works, it works, and I will change it in the outline, and then I will continue writing until I get to that point. I think I had for my latest first draft that I finished, which I call Maze Whip, I had three different endings in mind. And up until the very last moment, like right before I was going to write those chapters, I had one of the endings written down. And then I brainstormed and soundboarded with one of my friends, like we just talked about. And she was like, no, the third one's the best option. So I ended up changing the entire ending of the book to fit this ending that was so much better. So I think again, it goes into deviation from the outline, but I think you got to be okay to be flexible. At least if you're going from a pantser to a plotter, it definitely helps to be willing to allow yourself to make changes like that, even when you're in the middle of writing.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And I think this for me is when I know there are some authors who are like, my characters don't talk to me. I'm like, my characters 100% talk to me. Like, I feel like I know my characters so well that they're like alive in my brain and directing the story, and I'm just the one writing it down. And so, like, when I'm in the drafting stage, there are 100% points where I completely change a scene, or a character completely surprises me and I add a complete new scene. And
Yep.
so being willing to do what the story requires, even if that means deviating from the outline, is super important.
Yep, for sure.
Cool. All right. So my next one is to always write everything down, even if you think you'll remember it if you're in the middle of something. When I'm outlining a new story like I am right now, even if I'm revising another project or editing a client manuscript, I feel like in my brain, it's just constantly simmering with ideas, even if I'm not consciously aware of it. And anytime I get a new idea for my story, I have a document for the project. I open it up and quickly type the idea in there just so I don't forget. And also because when you're outlining, you're not going to use every idea you come up with, but some of those ideas could be recycled for other stories. And so you never know what could come up down the road. Or you might have an idea and you don't think it would work, but then when you're in the middle of outlining later, you think, oh my goodness, I should have written that down because it definitely works. So I definitely recommend to write everything down, no matter how small.
Yeah, for sure. Agreed. Do not wait because you will forget. I know this from
Yeah.
experience.
Awesome. What's your next one? We have 2 more each.
Yes, thank you for the reminder. I appreciate that. So my next one would be, again, this is how I personally do it, so take this with a grain of salt. But I would personally not recommend outlining your entire world building mechanism before you begin draft one, just because so much can change as you're drafting, as we've been talking about. I feel like having all of that strict information for your world building down before the first draft can be difficult. And I used to do that. I used to do world building outlines, and I would describe the economic society, the trade markets, all of this really complicated world building stuff, and it would kill my urge to write every single time. So if you are doing world building or world building outlines like I did, I would highly recommend that you do them after draft one. And when you're taking a break from draft one and draft two, it really does help, and it helps you flesh out more of what you might want to add in revisions as well.
I love that. For me personally, like, especially with the setting descriptions, I know world building extends beyond that, but with the setting especially, like, I just need to know where is this book set, and then as I'm drafting, my mind kind of imagines the place, and so it comes to life on the page as I'm imagining it. And also with, like, fantasy or sci-fi where you have, like, magic systems and a lot of complicated things, it might be helpful to know a little bit about them before you start drafting, especially if those are integral to the story, but I completely agree with you that if you have everything down before you start drafting, that might restrict your imagination. And as you're starting to explore the story and the characters and get them in the different scenes and see how the story unfolds, you might get new ideas for the world building that you didn't have before that you might have not included if you were sticking very strictly to a world building outline.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
Amazing. So, my next one is to ask yourself why. And this is something I do a lot when I'm critiquing for my Amethyst Ink authors and for my own work as well. If you have a really cool idea for a scene or you really want a character to do a certain thing, always ask yourself why, because this is something readers will be asking themselves too. Everything in the story needs to make sense from the character's actions to aspects of the world, and just because something is super cool doesn't mean that it's the perfect fit for the story or justified in the world or character that you've created. And so, always asking yourself why and making sure you have an answer to that question will make sure that everything makes sense for your story.
Mhm. Definitely, definitely agree. Motives and intentions in writing will help make your writing so much clearer.
Last one, Riley, what is it?
Last one. This one's a little unorthodox. So, my last one is going to be a recommendation to do outlines for your revisions as well. And what I mean by that is when I outline before the book, write the first draft, and then I let my book sit for a little bit. But while I'm writing that first draft, I come up with outlines for future drafts. So I have 3 documents open at all times: the outline for the previous draft, the outline for the next draft, and the actual book itself. And having that next draft's outline open where I'm listing down, oh, this needs to be fixed in Act 1, this character needs to do this in Act 2, et cetera, does help define a little bit more of what I'm aiming toward and what I need to correct. It also eliminates the need to reread my manuscript because I don't like doing that. I love my stories, but I also have no patience when it comes to rereading because I immediately want to edit as soon as I start reading. So for people like me who just need to dive in as soon as they start editing, that's one of my recommendations for sure.
I love that because I do that as well. I think it's really important to have a clear revision plan because, especially if you're getting notes from beta readers or editors, and especially if you're getting that from more than one person, it can be extremely overwhelming. I am not the person to switch between different people's comments and manuscripts. That would be super overwhelming. So, what I do is I get the comments back from people and any like big picture things, I'll create, like you said, an outline and kind of combine everyone's comments. And so when I'm going back through the manuscript, I'm not jumping between a bunch of different people's comments. I'm following a very clear linear path for myself, which is a combination of everybody's notes.
Yes. Yep. Smart way to do it.
Amazing. So my last one is to ask yourself, but what if? I think sometimes as authors, we can settle on the first idea that we think of, which typically isn't the most creative because we probably thought of that because we read it somewhere else or heard of it from somebody else. And so going with your first idea isn't always the best. And so I always try to ask myself, okay, yeah, that's cool, but like, what if this? And what if this? And keep asking yourself that because the more you do that and the more you think outside the box, the more creative and original your story will be.
Oh my gosh, I'd never heard of that used in the outlining point. I've heard of that with plot twists and how you should keep asking what if when you're trying to write plot twists because the last idea you have will generally be the best and least expected. But that is so smart to do for outlines as well. I'm going to implement that actually. That's very smart.
Amazing. Well, we shared so many great tips. I love how they were all different. We didn't overlap directly, which is super cool. So everyone just got 10 different tips on outlining, which is great. But just to wrap up our chat, what are some final thoughts you would love to share about outlining in general?
So, as somebody who's written for a long time and outlined for a long time as well, I think the majority of my writing that I've taken seriously has been outlined. Is don't take it too seriously. I know we talked about that kind of a lot in this episode, but I think it's super important not to stress yourself out. Writing is supposed to be fun, it's supposed to be passionate, it's supposed to be a joy making endeavor. And if you're not having fun outlining, then it's not necessary to do it, or not even necessary to do it as much as you might think you might need to. So I think just remember to take a break, take a breather, do what's best for you in your writing. And if you want to outline, start small. Don't jump into a huge outline immediately. If you want to start outlining, just start from the scraps and then build up from there.
Amazing. I love that. And everyone's writing processes are different. So if you're listening to this and you're going, but I don't like outlines, I like pantsing, shout out to you. And I highly recommend you stick to what works for you. Don't just outline because to me and Mylee said so. It's really important
Yeah.
to do what works for you. And like you said, have fun. Outlining is one of my favorite parts of the writing process. It's when I'm imagining a new story, and it's the anticipation for me before I actually start drafting. Drafting's my least favorite. I love revising, but
Oh my gosh,
outlining. Oh
same.
yeah, we're twins. Yeah. But outlining is always very fun for me because I get super excited. And that's another thing too. If you're outlining a project and it's just not clicking, that could be an indication that maybe set this project aside and start something new, which avoids the whole thing of starting to write a book, getting 20,000 words into it and being, I don't know about this. Like, if you outline it, you can get a sense for if you're excited to write the book or not. And of course, if you start writing it and you find it's not right for you, totally think about starting another project. But I found that I've had many instances where I started outlining on a book and it just didn't resonate, and then I would shift to a different idea and be completely obsessed where I make it my whole personality and don't stop talking about it for months. So that's a really good indication too of what is natural for you and what story you should write next.
Yes, I definitely agree. I have done that before as well and trying to outline stuff and it just does not work out sometimes. So
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for joining me. This brings us to your plot twist, where I get to ask you a random, fun question you could have never seen coming. Are you ready?
yes, I'm so excited.
If a genie could grant you one publishing related wish that is super specific, not just I want an offer of representation or I want to hit the New York Times bestseller, let's say very, very, very specific wish, what would it be?
Oh gosh, I hope this is specific enough. I would love an Illumicrate book box deal that would make my day and have like in the box specifically if I got the ones I'm querying now agented and got that box with them, I'd want them to have little gold trinkets in it to match the aesthetic of one of the books I'm currently querying, which is a gold kind of themed story. So I think that'd be really cool.
Amazing. Well, let's manifest it.
Yes, right.
Well, thank you so much for joining me. Can you please share with everybody where they can connect with you online?
So there's a few places, and thank you so much for having
You're
me. There's a
welcome.
few places you can find me online. I'm at Mylee J Miller on Twitter. I'm at Mylee J. Miller on Instagram. I'm also on Blue Sky under Mylee J Miller, and I have a website, MyleeJMiller.com.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, and listeners, that is a wrap on this chapter of the show with Mylee, all about outlining. If you enjoyed our conversation, please consider leaving Literary Blend a review and giving it 5 stars to help others just like you discover it. Also, if you have friends in publishing who you think would enjoy the show, please pass it along to them. Thanks for listening, and until we flip to the next chapter, happy reading and writing.